In this video, we are going to go through the process of setting up our authentication or login section of our application. To start off, underneath the account controller, we're going to implement our login action. Now this action will actually require an HTTP GET and an HTTP POST process. The GET is pretty straightforward. It's just going to present the user with the view. The view will have the login page for them to actually input their username and password. The POST method, on the other hand, will actually capture the authentication details. And we're going to use our user view model again for our POST back. And for now, we'll just return view. So we need to create our view for our login page, and to do that I'm going to right click on my HTTP GET action and choose Add View. I'm going to go ahead and choose the empty template, but I'm also going to select my user view model as my model class. I'll leave all my checkboxes as they are and click Add. So we now have a login view template. I'm going to go through and basically just incorporate our boxes using my HTML helpers. So I'm going to create a label, and this label will say username, and then at html.textbox4, and I'm going to use the username field, put a new line at the end, and label password colon, and then again HTML dot, and this will be password4, and it'll be for our password field. And then the final piece that I'll need is a submit button, and I'll give the value of login, and then we just need to wrap all of this inside of an HTML.begin form. So it's not the prettiest login box, but it will get the job done. So at this point we'll go ahead and click our play button. We'll do a build and load. And here's our page. Slight modification in our view. We'll add a BR tag there at the end just to push our login button down. That's really just aesthetics. Perfect. Okay, so now we have our login page, and now we just need to actually handle the process of logging in. So to do that, we'll jump back to our code, we'll hit stop, and flip back to our account controller. And the login process really takes place in just a series of simple steps. The first step will be for us to validate the input. This is to make sure we have a username and password. The second step will be for us to check for the user in the database. Third step will be for us to store the authenticated user in the ASP.NET framework, and this is to allow persistence. And basically what that means is that the next time the user logs in, or the next time the user comes to a page, the next page will see that the user is logged in, and then as they're navigating throughout the site, the system will still know that they're logged in. And then the final step is for us to redirect to our home page or landing page. Alright, so validation is pretty simple. We'll just simply say if user.username, do a string.is null or white space for that, and then we'll say error. I'll put the errors in just a moment. We'll say if the string is null or white space for user.password, we'll say error. So flipping back over to our view, I'm going to add one more section, which will be our validation summary. So I'm going to say at html.validation summary. And that will provide us with a block output for validation. So here we'll say this dot model state dot add model error no key, and then we'll simply say that username is required. And then we'll return the view, passing in our user model. Then we can just copy these two lines, paste them down here, and say that password is required. Alright, so that's our validation. The next step is we're going to need our DB context. And we'll also need a user DTO. And the goal here is we want to go from our context, grab all users, and then we want to get the first or default user, and then we're going to treat this as a lambda expression with like a where, and what we're going to say is where the user in the database username equals the user.username. And the reason I'm using the dot equals instead of just the equal sign is I want to use this string comparison enumerator, and I want to choose ordinal ignore case. And what that does is it allows us to check for usernames without worrying about whether it's uppercase or lowercase, and it basically will do a check for equal usernames without making it case sensitive. So we'll use that for the username, and then we'll do a double and then we'll say and the x.password. Whoop. I think I may have too many parentheses here. And x.password. And in this case, we do want it to be case sensitive. We'll say where that equals the user.password. And user.password is the password that was typed in by the user. And then by choosing first or default as our method call, what will happen is if there's a matching user, then we'll get back that user object, and if there is no match, we'll get back a null object. So now I'll say if user.dto equals null, then this dot model state dot add model error. We'll say invalid username or password, and return the view. And I'm not going to pass the model in this time because I want to clear out the username and password boxes. So this is basically to validate, and then we have to go through the process of persistence. Now, to persist a user, we actually have to go through a series of steps, and I'm going to go ahead and create a method called persistUser, and I'm going to pass in the user DTO. And I'm choosing to pass in the DTO because I want to use that data that's coming from the database versus the user entered data. I'm also going to allow Visual Studio to create the method for me, so I'm going to pull down my accelerator there and say generate method stub, and that'll create me this little private method below. And then inside of persistUser, we're going to go through the process of persisting the user and capturing the redirect URL. Now, with this utility class under system.web.security.forms authentication, this utility class has a method called getRedirectURL, and it actually kind of kills two birds with one stone. If you have a more complex authentication case, there's things such as form authentication tickets, there's some encryption methods in here off of this utility class. There's a lot of things that are actually built into this that you can use, but for this demonstration and really for most standard authentication models, just using this getRedirectURL is sufficient. So we'll get redirect URL, and then we'll pass in our user DTO.username. And if you want to persist the user authentication between instances of your browser, you can create a persistence cookie, which will actually allow you to close the browser, log out of the computer, log back into the computer, and then come back to the website and still be logged in. You're probably familiar with this from things like Facebook and Twitter, where the next time you come to Facebook, you're logged in automatically. So that's the Boolean that would allow you to do things like that. So I'm going to go ahead and set that to false though for our case. And then what we'll get back here is the redirect URL as a string, and we'll actually end up returning the redirect URL. So we'll change our return type from void to string. Alright. So those steps are pretty simplistic. Like I said before, there are things like form authentication tickets and a whole lot more that could be incorporated into here. But for this case, we'll just kind of keep it simple and just use the get redirect URL. That will give us all of the work that we need to make this work. So jumping back up into the login action, we're going to say that this is our redirect URL. And then down here, our final step is to redirect. Now, the reason I'm grabbing this redirect URL is that depending on if the person was trying to visit a specific page versus just log in, the results will end up being different. So what we're going to do here is we're going to say return redirect, and we're going to just use the standard redirect, and you'll see that this takes in a URL string, and what we can do here is just say redirect URL. We can also wrap this in an if statement and say if string is null or white space for redirect URL. We'll do something else, maybe go to home, else redirect to that redirect URL. So here we'll redirect to action, and we'll redirect to index off of the home controller. So that'll just give us that ability to handle both situations. So we'll go ahead and save. And then the final step is that we actually have to tell ASP.NET that we're going to go through the process of using authentication. So we have to jump into our web config to do that. Now, our web config has gotten pretty robust compared to how we started. And what we're going to need to do is actually come inside of this system.web element, and we need to add a couple of tags. So I'm going to do a less than sign, and I'm going to choose authentication. I'm going to do space, and I'm going to choose mode, and then the mode that I'm going to choose is forms. So I'm going to use forms authentication. I'm going to close my element, and then inside of that I'm going to choose forms again, and then we can set up our default URI, which I'm going to use as /, and then our login URI will be our action, or I'm sorry, our controller in action. So it's going to be / accounts, or account/login. And then the name of our authentication will be module 8 auth. If we want to require SSL, we can do that here. We can set a timeout, we can set sliding expiration, things such as authentication paths, and if we want to make it cookieless, there's lots of options in here, and most of that information can be found using MSDN. So we'll leave that. And then credentials, if you didn't have a database and you wanted to hard code your credentials, you could actually do that here, and this will allow you to add a user, one username and password at a time. But since we're using a database, we don't need to do that. So this setup should be sufficient. And the last thing we're going to do is authorization. And inside of authorization, we're going to deny any users that are anonymous. That's the question mark. And then we're going to allow, for now, all users. And these are authenticated users. Alright, so we'll save that. And then what I like to do is I'm going to add an index, or a home controller with an index action. So we'll add that, and then this view will just simply return content and say welcome. And then what I'd like to grab is from the user, if I say this.user, there's a user object, this.user.identity.name, and that'll actually give me the username of the user who's logged in. And we'll work more on this.user.identity in a future lecture video. So we've got everything in place, and now one additional thing to note is that this system.web.security.forms authentication under our persist user method, this is inside of our account controller, this method has actually changed from previous versions of the .NET framework. And what happens now is that this method only returns to us the URL. It does not actually authenticate the user. So to do that, we have to now do that in 2 steps. So we will start out by doing system.web.security.forms authentication, and then we're going to set the auth cookie. Set auth cookie actually takes the same parameters, so we'll do userdto.username, comma, and then we'll set this persistence cookie to false. And what this will do for us is it will actually store our authentication cookie and persist our user. So now that we have that in place, and this was part of the reason why I created this persist user method, was I wanted to pull that out so that if there were modifications that needed to be made, they could be done in the isolation of this method without gunking up the entire action. So that makes it a nice little simple space. So we'll go ahead now and we will run. And we'll see here that we get redirected straight to our login page. From here we can put in our username and password. And I'm actually going to put in a bad password. We'll hit login. We'll see that we come back with an error that says invalid username or password. So that's the error that came back. If I leave this blank and hit login, we get username is required. If I leave the password blank, we'll get password is required. Alright, I will put in the good password and hit login. And we get directed back to the home controller index action, our default route, and we get welcome and then my username. So we've now successfully logged into our application. The application knows who the logged in user is, at least their username, and from there we can now present data and set up roles and permissions for that user based off of their authentication.